It's exploring the question of whether China is the new and sole superpower. That's what this panel is here to talk about. You have the right folks to do that. Roy Kamphausen spent years as a foreign area officer covering China, has gone on to do all kinds of wonderful things. Was asked by the Senate a few years ago to help review where security and economics intersects with China. So we couldn't have a better moderator, and of course in his current capacity as president of the National Bureau on Asian Research, that gives him some insights as well. So Roy, over to you.
Thank you, Luke. Can you hear me? Well, this is a treat to moderate the best panel of the day. My organization has offices in both Seattle and Washington, D.C., the National Bureau of Asian Research. But I live here in Connecticut, old family farm, about 30 minutes northeast of here. And so I'm a Yankee wannabe. It'll be 3 more generations, before you can be a Yankee. You have to live here for that long. But and a Connecticut citizen. So Megan, on behalf of those of us who live here, thank you so much for this annual buffet of national security leaders that you bring to our state. It's remarkable to be a part of this. It's, I guess, the second or third time I've been able to join. And it's a treat to be on this distinguished panel. Let me introduce our 2 speakers, and then we'll get into the question and answers. General Charles Hooper, and you have their bios, I'm not going to read them, but he retired as the director of the Defense Security Cooperation Agency just last summer. That organization is responsible for managing $50 billion a year in foreign military sales, plus a whole lot of other stuff, 20,000 people that worked for him. He's now a senior counselor at the Cohen Group in Washington, D.C., and affiliated with many other organizations. But at his core, he's an Asianist and an old China hand, and a friend and mentor to me of more than 25 years. And I'm so pleased that he's a director on the board at the National Bureau of Asian Research. Mr. Mark Granzer, I met today. He's chairman of the board of the Business Executives for National Security, a unique grouping of 425 or more business and industry executives who seek to apply best business practices to address the nation's most pressing security challenges. He's had a distinguished career in industry prior to that, including major practice groups at Booz Allen Hamilton in both government solutions and civilian practice. And he will bring, I think, a very important perspective to our discussion of strategic competition by looking at issues from the lens of business and industry and innovation. My first question, General Hooper. Of late, much attention has been paid to almost everything the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, does. You spent nearly a decade in China in various capacities, interacting with and studying the PLA. We've seen the assertive military posture near Taiwan. Just yesterday, 38 aircraft entered the Air Defense Identification Zone. We can talk about what an ADIZ is if you want, but that's the most ever. 2 days ago, the 39th PLA Navy Task Group set off for the Gulf of Aden to do counter-piracy operations. We've seen combined exercises, the largest ever with Russia just completed, and I haven't even talked about the South China Sea or East China Sea. So how should our audience today think about these developments of the Chinese military? China's overall military modernization program and Beijing's ambitions in its near periphery in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, and thanks for that question, Roy. And the short answer to the question is that we should be concerned. We should be concerned, and we should focus very carefully on how we maintain our qualitative and quantitative edge, and I can talk a little bit about that later. Let me give you a thumbnail sketch of what we're dealing with, because a lot of people talk about the PLA, and I'm going to spend about a minute or so giving you an idea of what they're doing and why. China's the only country in the world that has 13 separate international borders. It's the only country on earth that has that. 4 of them are nuclear, okay? And when they look to the east, they see an Asia-Pacific or a Pacific Ocean that has been dominated by the United States since the Battle of Midway, okay? The Battle of Midway, we've dominated both aerospace and Navy. The United States Navy has been the preeminent force. And so when you talk about PLA modernization, their principal focus of their modernization has been to counter the United States in any possible scenario, be it over Taiwan, East China Sea, South China Sea, or any other scenario. So we are both simultaneously, we are for them, as we would say in the military, both their worst case scenario and their most likely scenario. And you have to look at the world as China sees it. So you hear a lot of talk about the first island chain. And let me describe what that means for you. So if you look at a map and you imagine a line that runs through Japan, down through the Ryukyus to Okinawa, where we have a significant troop presence, and then it works through Taiwan, where we have a law that commits us to providing for the defense of Taiwan, defense article and services. It goes down through the Philippines, where we have a defense treaty, and then kind of circles around the 9-dash line, or that tongue of the South China Sea that China claims. And so from China's perspective, they see themselves as surrounded by hostile forces, more or less, particularly to the east. So that military modernization has been focused on breaking out of that first island chain and being able to project their power to Taiwan and beyond. So what has that bought them? 20 years of double-digit defense investments in defense and defense budgets. It's bought them a 350-ship Navy that many of us feel is the largest in terms of quantity in the world. It's bought them aircraft carriers that came online long before we anticipated they would, 4 nuclear ballistic missile submarines, and they want to double that in the next few years, as well as attack submarines and experimentation into autonomous submersibles and other technologies. It's bought them a strategic rocket force that consists of 1,250 intermediate range ballistic missiles, 100 nuclear-tipped intercontinental ballistic missiles, and they'd like to double that in the next 4 or 5 years. And those are the 2 crown jewels of their force. They also have a strategic support force, and this is where you see the bulk of their investment in artificial intelligence, in offensive cyber warfare, electronic warfare, and information warfare. And they also, as we know, have the largest land army in the world. They've come very far, very fast. I remember in 1980, I was studying in Beijing. In 1989, I was studying in Beijing, and I had an opportunity to run into my first group of Chinese soldiers. I was a young captain, like you guys will be very shortly. And I come upon my first group of Chinese soldiers, and they're sitting in the middle of a dirt road surrounding this one-person tractor, and then they can't figure out the tractor. So I walk up in Chinese, and I say, "What's wrong with the tractor?" And I caught them off guard. They were not expecting this foreigner to appear out of nowhere and start speaking Chinese. And so I said, "What's wrong with the tractor?" And they said, "Well, we can't figure it out. It's broken." Well, the tractor had a chain sprocket drive like a bicycle, and the chain had come off. And so, I'm looking at this group of soldiers that can't figure this out. Now, every American child knows that if you put the chain on the small sprocket and then on the top of the large sprocket, and you push it forward, it'll rechain the drive. And so that's what I did. And they were all amazed and oohed and awed. And so I took an opportunity. I said, "Well, what do you guys do in the Army?" They said, "We're tank mechanics." And so I walked away from that engagement feeling pretty good about our military edge over China. Having said that, they've come a long way since then, and they've amassed significant capabilities that can threaten us. And in fact, Admiral Davidson, the former Pacific Command commander, has estimated that if we do not invest more in our own defense and in bolstering our forces in the Pacific by 2025, the Chinese will reach parity with our forces in the Pacific. So it is a formidable force. They are not 10 feet tall, and I can talk about that a little later, but we should be concerned, Roy, because it is a formidable force, and it is directed directly against us.
Well, in a minute, I'm going to come back to you and ask kind of the net assessment question, given your other experiences in the Army. But I want to first turn to Mark. And Mark, you come at this from an entirely different perspective. And so maybe you've written an important book about mega communities. You're the chairman of the board at Benz. You think a lot about innovation. Maybe just give us your opening thoughts on how to think about the challenge, and then we'll drill down a little bit more.
Super, thank you. Thank you for that, and thank you for that, General. And I have no experience with Chinese tractors or Chinese Army. What I do have experience in is with many of our companies have actually tried to do business in China, and that turned out to be a rather challenging undertaking. While the market seemed to appear very good for us, the fact of IP theft and other types of coercive practices made it quite difficult. So certainly on the technological front, the way we feel, some of our companies now, we feel we're actually in this great power competition with you. This is not just military. Matter of fact, we're feeling part of it, and companies are starting to wake up to it. And in my organization, as you mentioned, Roy, we have 425 CEOs or C-suite executives from across many commercial industries. Only 5% are actually in the defense market. And we formed what was called a Competitiveness Council, where we're actually talking about this. We're bringing these leaders together, talking about how do we deal with it, what should we be doing differently. And they're actually forming up a primer now that we're going to be releasing to CEOs on what to do and what not to do, and ensure that you don't inadvertently hurt the U.S. in this great power competition through business practices and unbeknownst to the leaders. So when we look at the technology side of things, we're finding ourselves falling quite behind. And I could dive into that, especially in the AI area later. So what do we do? Well, one of the conclusions we come up with was we can't out-China China. We think that's a losing strategy. We're just not going to win at that. We need something new. We need something different. We need something that will actually harness public sector, private sector cooperation in ways like it's never happened before. And we often talk of public-private partnerships. The problem is they're too limited. We need something that actually is dynamic and grows with the situation. And that's what we call the mega community concept. And I could go into that too if the audience has an interest. But it's basically aligning public sector, private sector, and civil society against a common cause and having unity of action. And finally, on the technology side, and I've seen it up close and personal. I angel funded many of these critical technologies in the early phases. U.S. venture funds are very strong right now. One of the problems we have to take on, though, is that we have the valley of death problem of moving out from the labs into production and commercialization, and we have to protect our IP along the way. And finally, as I said, public sector, private sector cooperation. The other thing we might want to think about, and it was mentioned earlier, is international, multilateral cooperation. Very recently, we knew during COVID that our supply chains were not very resilient. And that was because in many cases, we just didn't know what the sources were. So we had very poor, what's called poor illumination of the supply chains. And then we also had practices of just-in-time inventory, which made it more vulnerable. And consequently, we made choices around cost. So where it was cheaper to go offshore, we did that. What's happening now, there's an initiative underway with businesses and government to actually build more resilience in our supply chain for certain items. And we call it right shoring. What are the things we have to do in the United States? But it even went a step further. There's an agreement now with Canada, the UK, and Australia to consider as allies friendly shoring. And that's a new program. So it doesn't all have to be the United States, but it has to be with countries that we have great relationships and can trust. So that's kind of the preamble, and I could dive into any one of those elements.
I want to come back to you on this. There's a premise to what you're saying, which is American companies have great products and services, and they can excel in a market, even in China, if the playing field's level, and if we understand the terms of competition, and if we understand the right parts of our supply chain that really can't be there. And so let's come back to that in a minute and just hear more of your thoughts. But Hoop, back to you. So I've heard a lot of General Hooper's stories over the years. I had not heard the mechanics story. My own parallel one is going to a rifle range with a Pele soldier. You guys will appreciate this. And for hearing protection, he picked up a spent cartridge and stuck it in his ear, thereby creating a de facto echo chamber as we were firing off their AK-47 equivalent. So it's hard not to think of those stories and juxtapose them against all the modernization developments that you highlighted. Given all of your experience, 41 years in the Army, in both China-related, Asia-related, but also a lot of other stuff that was not related, how do we think about this net assessment?
Well, it's very interesting you mentioned that. And first of all, I want to say that the short answer to your question is Certainly, we need to be very concerned about these capabilities that the Chinese military is developing. They are significant, and they have invested heavily, as many of you know, in artificial intelligence for reasons to speed up and accelerate their ability to respond to military contingencies. But they are not 10 feet tall. As you might recall, there was a military out there. It was the fourth best equipped military on earth, and we defeated them. This is Iraq. We defeated them in 100 hours. And so when people say quantity has a quality all its own, I usually respond by saying, yeah, but quality has a quality all its own as well. My Chinese colleagues used to brag a lot about their aircraft carrier and how they were able to bring it online quickly, and they're bringing 2 more online very quickly. And I used to look at them and I used to go, well, you know, we've been flying planes off ships for 100 years. It's harder than it looks, okay? And I also used to tell them the number of countries with aircraft carriers is expanding. The number of countries that have actually fought an aircraft carrier in combat is not. And the last thing I'd mention to you, and and I'm looking at the young people down here, is the issue of ethics and leadership. Xi Jinping has just replaced his 4th commander in what they call their Western Theater Command. This is the command that faces India to the south, and it has responsibility for Xinjiang. He's just replaced the 4th commander of that theater command in 1 year, in 12 months, okay? Because clearly he's not satisfied with the level of leadership. He understands intellectually that in information-based warfare in the 20th century, he needs a soldier force and a leadership that is innovative and that is willing to take risk. And he recognizes that that is not the force he has. Corruption is rampant in the PLA. The soldiers don't trust their officers, and the officers are unwilling or unable to take appropriate risk that is necessary in warfare. And so I watched that carefully. We spent a lot of time focused on technology. I learned in my 3rd tour in Beijing, as I was looking at the PLA, that while the technology is important, I asked about the people. Why are they fighting? And do they have the ability to apply the technology? And I go back to my story about the tank mechanics, okay? This is essentially still a peasant force. Yes, they're being given extraordinarily capable technology, but the question is, are they able to apply it? So I just put that out for food for thought in terms of capabilities. I think we still have a qualitative edge. I think our people, I'll never forget a PLA, and I'll finish with this, PLA airborne commander. I had the opportunity to escort him to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and we showed him a live fire and a bunch of other stuff and all of the military capabilities that we could bring to bear at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. And at the end, we had a round robin. He had an opportunity to meet some of our soldiers. And at the end of it, I asked him, what impressed you the most about everything you've seen? He did not hesitate. He said, your soldiers. He said, your soldiers are 5 generations ahead of our soldiers, okay? And he gleaned that just from a short exposure to our people. And I walked away from that exchange feeling pretty good about our chances in a conflict. And I'll stop there.
I'd like to pick up on the point of the technology adoption because that's so critical. First and foremost, under the great power competition, U.S. industry, American businesses, want to try to maintain the lead in various technologies. And there's some where we've lost the lead, but we want to regain it. And there's going to be some where we're not going to be able to regain it, frankly, and then we're going to have to be masters at adaptation and pulling it in. So we don't have to necessarily lead every technology. We just got to be able to rapidly adapt it and apply it. And that's just so central as we go forward in this great power competition.
Talk a little bit more about friendly shoring and,
Sure.
and reshoring and what can we afford to keep in China?
That's a great question. You know, it's identifying, and Congress actually has a subtask looking at this. It's identifying what are the critical things that we have to make sure we can get when we need them, right? That could be things like prescription drugs and rare earths, for example. One of the discoveries we made, and you'd appreciate this, and you would probably know a lot about this. Apparently in ammunition there's a thing called propellant. That's what makes the bullet go, right? Mm-hmm. You know that 90% of the propellant that we use in our military today is made in China? We think that's not too smart. So, you know, businesses are saying, hey, maybe we need to bring some of that manufacturing capability here, at least to maybe a friendly nation, because my thinking is if we go to war with China, perhaps they won't sell us any more propellant. So things like that are very important, and we need to really do a zero-based review of these critical elements. And the good news is we are making progress, but with this supply chain issue. But I think that the progress we make on a supply chain issue should be expanded to this global competition. Because why should we compete alone with China? Let's compete with our friends. Now, it turns out the U.S., according to the Global Innovation Index, the U.S. is ranked number 3 in high economies in terms of economic innovation. China is ranked number 1 in the next tier high income area. You put China and you put the U.S. aside, the next top 4 innovative economies are South Korea, Singapore, Switzerland, and Sweden. Now, the last time I looked, those countries tend to have more values like us than the Chinese Communist Party. So I think we could probably cut a deal with them of some sort to make it work. That's hard, really hard, I know it is. But we should aspire to do that. And maybe we could do that through the bridge, not just even policy to policy, but maybe we could do that through businesses. You know, the reason I'm at Benz and I'm chairman of the board is I think Benz is in a very unique position to help us, help our nation get there through the business relationships as well.
Well, this is fascinating, and I just keep talking to you guys all day, but we have some questions from Zoom, so Megan, we should hear from somebody who's watching from around the country.
We're still in my chair. Perfect. So this is about as state control over business and social interactions within the Western world becomes more constrictive with China, do you believe we'll see a decline in China's global economic and soft power? Or can they maintain their current status as a future, maybe current superpower? What does this mean for the future U.S. relationship? And I think this is a question coming in from Kansas City.
I'll take a first shot.
Just about the model, right?
Sure.
At least in part.
Well, you know, their Belt and Road strategy is quite interesting. They're investing in countries in their infrastructure, and then they're sort of requiring a return. And it's kind of scary if you look at where they're investing, because it's in key nations in Africa with very important minerals and rare earths. It's also really, I've just learned, also in Latin America. I mean, they're now in our hemisphere, Ecuador and other countries they're investing in. Now, what we're seeing, though, and what I'm sensing, and I would defer to the general on this, is that some of their very aggressive tactics that are most recently happening, like if you look at what they did with Australia, when Australia asked a question, they boycotted all the wine and lamb and everything. It's this wolf warrior approach that they have is getting pushback in some areas and scaring countries. And apparently, you would know this more than I guess Wolf Warrior is like one of their TV action guys, and I guess it's like Captain America with sharp teeth or something. But so you know, that's not working very well for them. The other thing is there's more of a social awareness with how they're treating like the Uyghurs and how they clamp down in Hong Kong. And that's causing some pushback, and I think it is hurting them on the soft power side. So it's interesting to me, and at one point I'd like you guys to answer, they are escalating their efforts. I'm not sure the escalation's serving them well, but I'm curious as to why they're escalating them now. Is there something else going on we don't know about? Over to you, sir.
Well, very quickly, I couldn't agree with you more that many of their aggressive tactics are backfiring. I spent 3 years as the Director of Strategy for Africa Command, and during my tenure, I always tell people I spoke more Chinese in sub-Saharan Africa than I did when I was at the Pacific Command as a Deputy J5. But many African nations are starting to resent Chinese presence, and they're starting to push back. The Chinese do these construction projects, that's true, but they bring in all their own people. And then those people stay in those countries, constituting a merchant class that kind of pushes the local merchant class out of business. And so these types of very aggressive stances are working against them in many parts of the world. So, and to illustrate that further, in my last job, I traveled around this issue of not out-Chinesing the Chinese, and I often add to that, we can't win by out-Russian the Russians as well. I dealt with a lot of senior officials, and of course my chief competitors were the Chinese and the Russians, and long story short, there was this one senior official, and we had been discussing with him acquiring U.S. systems, and I knew he was making a trip to Moscow, so I ended up running into him at an air show, and I teased him. I said, did you get everything on your wife's shopping list when you went to Moscow? And he kind of smiled at me. But here's what he said that really stuck with me. He said, I'll do business with the Russians, and you're right, Hooper. I come back from Moscow, and I feel I'm much better when I come back from Moscow financially and other things. But he looked at me and said, I'll do business with them, but I don't trust them. He said, you people and your rules and regulations drive me crazy. And he was talking about foreign military sales, and we have a lot of restrictions. He said, but I know when I do business with you, I'm getting what I paid for. And I walked away from that conversation saying, okay, I can live with that. That's okay. And that's what distinguishes us. We'll win this strategic competition by leveraging those characteristics that distinguish us from our competitors, not trying to mimic our competitors.
And on top of that, I would tell you the other choice for businesses, and this is in our primer, is that you have to make choices. There's market opportunities, but you're giving some things up, you're incurring risk, and there are ESG concerns in terms of environmental and social. And so businesses will be put in a place of making choices around that. And frankly, as I look at my constituency at Benz, these 400 people, they're self-selected, they're patriots. They serve as Benz. So what Benz does is it's the craziest model in the world. We all put in money so we can work for free for the government. That's what it is. And so all these CEOs come in, and we try to give advice to the government through a business lens. And so why do they do it? Well, some have served in uniform or in the government, and they want to continue their service. Others are in businesses like Federal Express or logistics, and they really count on a strong national security. And then others do it for personal reasons. The guy who founded Benz in 1982 is a guy named Stanley Weiss. And I asked him, Stanley, why'd you do this? He goes, because being dead is bad for business. And he's right, being dead is bad for business. And so, we need national security so that businesses, as they get more educated, are gonna help, and they can help. And they'll start making the right choices. But without that knowledge, it's amazing to me how many businesses don't even understand. They see China, say, oh, big consumer market, let's go over there, until they find out what happens.
There's welcome your comment on this. There's a tisk dimension to our comment about China's policies, right? We say, well, isn't it the case? And I'll never forget my first day or second day in Beijing, General Hooper, then Lieutenant Colonel Hooper said to me, if you rule out these 4 or 5 words from your vocabulary, you'll do a lot better in China, right? Wouldn't you think? Wouldn't it be better? Isn't it the case? If you exclude those words, then your pathway to understanding China better really improves. But we tend to say, well, the Uyghurs, treatment of the Uyghurs is bad. Yeah, no kidding. The rapid assumption of power that was already theirs 23 years ago, 24 years ago in Hong Kong, that somehow I don't think we have to persuade ourselves that is not a great system. Hope you have some thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, listen, I was in Tiananmen Square on July 1st, 1997. There were so many people in the square. I lived about a half a mile from Tiananmen Square. I had to carry my bicycle over my head the last half mile. That's how many people were there. And I'll tell you, there was no discussion in Tiananmen Square about one country, two systems. The discussion in Tiananmen Square was, it's ours and we have it back now. And it was
talking about Hong Kong.
Hong Kong. This is Hong Kong. And it was only a matter of time before this would fail. We have to stop mirror imaging, and we have to view this situation the way it is. And yes, the Chinese are in a hurry. Xi Jinping understands that he's facing a number of issues. The economy is fragile. We're looking at now a real estate crisis that they're having. They'll muddle through. They have a demographic issue because they're getting older very quickly before they get rich enough to support that elderly population. And they have some serious ecological issues in China. The Huangpu River in Shanghai, there are parts of it that literally bubble and boil. The water is unfit for even industrial use. And so they are in a hurry and they are aggressive, but and that does give some pause for thought. But by the same token, it offers opportunities for the United States, for our businesses and others to move forward. And you have to understand these realities about China moving forward.
Yes, sir, and I would highlight on that demographic, that's a significant. Any strong economy has to have the right demographics. China had a one-child policy for a number of years. They lost somewhere between 200 and 400 births. So their demographic pyramid, which should look really like this, with fewer older people, more younger people, is actually the inverse. And now you have a situation where it's a 4-2-1 problem. You have 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 worker, no funded pension program, no discretionary cash. Therefore, even the economy that might look really good may not be good because it's cash strapped. The other part of their economy is it's completely debt ridden. There's a lot of default on debt. I think Xi used dollars to keep people working and to keep them happy, and without any notion of having a return come into play. Now, we've been saying all the downsides of China. There's a couple scary upsides, which if I may.
I was going to ask you about AI, which you teed
go
up
right
earlier.
there. Okay, so 1957, Russians launched Sputnik, the first Earth-orbiting satellite, right? It really shocked us. It woke us up. Matter of fact, what did we do? We created an organization called DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and guess what? The great space race began. And so we were behind, but we did get ahead. So there's a hope, right? You were talking about this the other night at the VIP session. Now, why is China ahead, so far ahead, and they are in AI? They had their Sputnik moment in 2016. One of the national pastime in China is the game of Go. Everybody plays it. It's a straightforward board game. Matter of fact, it's an ancient board game. It's the oldest running board game in history of mankind. It's a complex board game, much more complex than chess. Every move has 250 possibilities, and there's typically 150 moves. So that's 250 to the 150th power, approximately, which is, by the way, a 1 followed by 3,100 zeros. That's the number of possible moves, seriously. So, complex. The top ranking Go player recognized by the world was a guy named Lee Sedol. In 2012, a company created a neural network cyber application called AlphaGo, and it competed against Lee Sedol, and it beat him 4 times out of 5. That was their moment. Now, this AI today is not your father's AI. I actually wrote an article in 1987 about AI and AI in the military battlefield. But back then it was backward chaining and logic and heuristics. Today it's neural nets, and it's where the data writes the software. So if you get more data, it gets better with experience. So here's the problem. Who owns all the data in China? The CCP. And guess what? Are they getting data anywhere else? Anybody use TikTok around here? There are other channels they have to get data. If they get this data, they're going to have the more superior AI. So that's a concern. Over.
Hacks of OPM, access to either legally or illegally of medical records of Westerners or any other country, all of this feeds into the data accumulation, which makes the AI so much more effective. Megan, could we have another? Luke.
Well, I guess maybe taking us back to Africa, since I focus on Africa nowadays and power and the like there. Eric Olander's a guy that runs something called the China-Africa Project. He's kind of an interesting guy to key off of, and he talks about how you're seeing the Chinese do power deals in 7 months or quicker, and how they're real amazing, kind of, I don't know if amazing is the right word for it, decentralized execution that you'd almost think the American style. You know, if the road is 2 inches off, they just fix it the next day, where we kind of send it up the chain of command and go into paralysis for months. So maybe an observation on that, but more about exchanges is on my mind. It's probably not working quite the same way during the pandemic, but China takes government officials by the thousands and trains them and offers them programs. I don't think we do quite the same in Africa and other places. And then, of course, it's been tricky in academia, so how does that fit into it?
Why don't we start with you, given your experience?
Well, I would tell you it fits instrumentally into it, because when you catch young people, particularly aspiring professionals at that early part of their careers, and you invest in them, you put an imprint on them. I would tell you that Secretary McCarthy talked about Egypt. I was in Egypt as a senior military officer during that time he was talking about. And I'll tell you that, just by way of example, in China, when I was in China, I couldn't get anybody to return my phone calls, okay, when there was a crisis, okay? It was almost a joke. They'd say, we're keeping the lines of communication open except when we have a crisis, and then they wouldn't answer the phone. In Egypt, I could get a deputy minister of defense to answer his cell phone at 3 o'clock in the morning. Do you know why? Because the president, the minister of defense, the chief of the general staff, the chief of the military intelligence department, the commander of the Navy, and the commander of the Air Force all went to school in the United States. All of them, okay? And so they identified with the United States in terms of, in a commercial sense. I just had this discussion on Africa the other day. The Chinese are there commercially, and we are not. We're just not there. And now, in my current capacity, I talk to a lot of companies about Africa, and and people roll their eye. It's too hard to do. The risks are too high. But the Chinese are there, and we are not. And we have to be there because that's how we shape and influence future generations of consumers and business partners, both. So no, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'll end with, from a military perspective, and I say this for all the young people out there. Our education of military officers foreign military officers in the United States is the best value per dollar of any program we had. And I was responsible for all weapons sales worldwide. And I will tell you, the $5 or $6 million that we spend on international military education and training is far more beneficial and gives us a larger return on investment than half those weapon systems we sell, okay? Because it's all about people and relationships. And last time I looked, an F-16 doesn't answer the telephone during a crisis, but an F-16 pilot will. Mm-hmm. So I couldn't agree with you more, but in Africa in particular, we have to be there, and commercially and economically, and I'm just not sure we are right now.
That's really a call. I'm going to turn to Mark in a second on this question, but I mean, that's really a call for us to return to first principles, right? That has been true of our country for so long, and yet we've been questioning that in recent years, and so it's a very powerful statement. Mark?
Yeah, I would just pick up on a couple things the General mentioned, and General Crawford, I think, suggested this yesterday. As we have foreigners come here and get degrees and PhDs and this and that, there should be some automatic program where they get a green card and stay. That's key. We got to retain the talent's key. That's one of our in our primers to businesses. Build and retain talent, right? And attract talent, especially in areas like quantum computing and AI and big data and et cetera. I would say the other thing on the construction, though, it's interesting. When I live outside of Washington, D.C. in McLean, Virginia, and there's a metro line that's going from D.C. out to Dulles. And it's taken, 12, 15 years to build this metro line. In the meantime, China built 6 airports, right?
Still not finished, by the way.
Yeah, it's still not finished,
Still
right?
not finished.
Yeah.
One of the only capitals in the world where the public transportation system doesn't run to the airport of the capital.
So, now there's reasons for that. But we got to get past them. But the thing I would point out is that when we do things along standards. We follow safety standards. We do them around engineering standards. And that does take longer. In this case, there's political issues that held it up. But China doesn't have to follow any of those standards. They don't have to have a safe work environment for their people. They don't have to build a certain. So I don't know. I mean, if the things they build, I don't know if it's going to be like what you found when you were in Russia. Are they going to start crumbling in 10 or 15 years? I don't know. So that's an interesting part of the trade too. And I don't know enough about what's happening in African construction, but that would be a thought that I have.
Megan.
So this is a question about Taiwan. I mean, you started mentioning what happened yesterday, and it's very simple. Is the takeover of Taiwan by China inevitable?
Can I offer an editorial comment first? I had a discussion with a business leader in Seattle several days ago, and I was stunned to learn that he regarded the mainland takeover of Taiwan as a foregone conclusion, and that would be timed purely at the convenience and decision-making of Chairman Xi Jinping.
Okay, and I want to stress this is my opinion. The short answer to your question is no. There's been a great deal of heated rhetoric lately about the potential invasion or takeover of Taiwan. But there's a couple of, and I want to qualify my answer. There's a couple of reasons. Now, will the continued intimidation and threats against Taiwan continue? Absolutely. But I want to point out a couple of military facts here. Number one, there hasn't been a successful amphibious invasion since the 15th of September, 1950. Okay? There's a reason. Anybody want to guess? You young people, when was the last successful large-scale amphibious invasion? Young man? Incheon. Okay? It's harder than it looks. Okay? That's number one. Number two, Taiwan has the topography of Norway. Okay? There's a short coastal plain and then nothing but mountains. You could hide in those mountains forever and resist a force. Now, so number two, the Chinese military understands they have to win and they have to win quickly. They have to accomplish two major tasks. Number one, they have to force the capitulation and quickly occupy Taiwan. Number two, they have to be prepared to inflict a catastrophic defeat on the United States forces, okay? That's what they have to do to be successful. If they are not successful doing that, okay, even the Communist Party would have a hard time spinning that as a victory, okay? All we have to do is keep them from doing either of those two things, okay? Now, I want to make clear here, that is not to say that, and there's been a confusion of conflating what we in the military call the worst case scenario with the most likely scenario. The two of those have become conflated. We talk about the most likely scenario, for example, a missile strike or a whole-scale cyber attack on Taiwan, or an economic or naval blockade. All of those are possible, okay? And there are more likely scenarios. An invasion of Taiwan is the worst case scenario, and they understand they have to win and win quickly, otherwise they will lose. And so the short answer to that question is, while I consider the provocations will continue, okay? It is in Chinese grand strategy to continue to press and push to determine, and remember, the essence of a credible deterrent or a credible threat is not that you will actually act on it, but that your opponent thinks you will. And Sun Tzu in The Art of War says, if you can achieve victory through coercion without firing a shot, then that is the ultimate success in combat. So the short answer is, it is not imminent. I don't believe it's imminent.
But we have to stand fast, resolve,
Correct.
and respond to Chinese PRC challenges as they present themselves.
That is correct, and we need to continue our modernization. We need to continue to maintain our technological edge. We cannot provide them an opening of weakness, but as long as we maintain our vigilance, they will be hesitant to attempt a large-scale invasion.
Do we have a few more minutes, Luke and Megan? Does anyone in our audience here have a question? Right here.
So I'm wondering, that's okay. So by any chance, could the United States weaponize any mistrust between Chinese citizens and the Chinese Communist Party? And if so, could this put us at an advantage over them?
I have my own opinion.
Go ahead.
No. Even if they were, it doesn't matter whether they're communists, Republicans, or Democrats. They're Chinese. This is a very proud, homogenous culture. It's 4,000 years old. And after Tiananmen, and in fact, I would mark Tiananmen as a turning point. There was some belief prior to that that liberal democratic values were taking hold in China. And it was only after Tiananmen, and part of it was the foreign reaction, certainly the domestic reaction to Tiananmen. Those beliefs, were both within China and outside of China, started to take a turn. Most of the Chinese I talk to are extraordinarily patriotic, and that's not a function of government propaganda. They're Chinese, and they're incredibly proud of what their country's accomplished. And even if they weren't communists, they'd still be Chinese. So I'm highly skeptical as to whether or not we could exploit that.
In the back.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Just a couple of thoughts and then a big question. So what I've heard here is that we have to be careful of China, but they have issues with human rights. They have issues with the countries that they're developing relationships with now that are pushing back on them. They have issues with standards. They have issues with politics. Seems like we have all of those too. And looking from their standpoint, because we've heard that, they talk about civil rights here. They talk about how we've now left Afghanistan, and the Arab world's talking about how the United States forsakes their allies.
In the interest of time, sir.
So what I'm trying to say is, it sounds sort of smug to say that these are all of China's issues when they're ours, number one, because I think somehow it's saying we're going to think the way we are always going to think, that it's American ingenuity, and we are the leaders of the world.
Okay.
So economically, and I think that's the big thing, economically, I'm wondering if all the things that you're talking about are feasible for us to do in our current climate with all of our debt. It seems like America's economic power is security. I'm sorry for going on.
Can we compete economically in view of all the challenges we face?
I think we have to. That's why I was trying to present somewhat more of a balanced picture. We're saying how tough China has it. There are several things they have definitely above us that we have to gain back the lead, or at least somehow neutralize. And if we don't, we could possibly see, if we don't compete, if we just sit back, we may not be the world power in the future.
And we happen to be really good at competition once we put our minds to it. And so there's a lot of optimism there. Did we have one last question?
If there's time, ma'am.
Do we?
Gentlemen, you both sort of spoke to cooperating with countries abroad that share our values, or even perhaps exporting our values via education of foreign military officers. But it seems that sometimes we also have to cooperate with people that may not share all of our values. We've cut arms deals with Saudi Arabia, which is still a monarchy where women just recently gained the right to drive, and where execution by beheading is still very much a thing. So how do we reconcile that? How do we justify that to the American people? And to what extent is that necessary to compete with China and perhaps with Russia as well?
I think it's absolutely necessary, and there will be instances, and I'm going to speak as someone who worked in political military affairs for quite some time. And to paraphrase my friend Mark, this is business. There will be instances where we will have common cause with countries that don't particularly share our values. We collaborate and cooperate very closely with Vietnam right now in the Asia-Pacific region. They don't share our values, but we do share a common threat. There is a point at which I will tell you real quickly, you don't necessarily have to proselytize your values in order for them to be effective. You can lead by example, okay? And Secretary Austin and the President talk about leading by not by the example of our power, but the power of our example, okay? And I've seen instances where even systems that are diametrically opposed to ours, they respect our values and who we are. And I've had Chinese colleagues that secretly told me aside that they admire our values. Heck, half the kids of the Chinese elite are in the United States in school right now, in private schools right now. So you can give an example without necessarily proselytizing your values, and that's where we get to not trying to out-Chinese and out-Russian the Russians.
Yeah, I would just add that when you assemble a mega community, you basically have stakeholders that actually compete at times. That's okay. Getting the minute signed, so I'm going to finish. But there's an overlapping vital interest that we all work towards. Shei, ni hao ma.
This
has been a fascinating panel. Thank you all for your engagement and interaction. Thanks to our two guests. Please join me in thanking them.